You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Aaron Rupar is one of the great chronicles of Trumpism. He's a keen observer, not just on Trumpism, but what it's done to America and what it's done to American media. As a reporter, first at Vox and then on his own leading public notice on Substack, Aaron's work is like among the most widely shared on the whole internet. On top of that, he's from Minnesota, and as I've long told all of you listening, it's folks from the Great Lakes states that are going to save the country this year. All right, Aaron, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
You watch tons of press conferences, hearings, rallies. You've seen more of politicians in action than most people. So I want to just get big picture, your takeaway on, Trump and the Republicans versus the Democrats. Like, how are they, sort of not just policy-wise, but sort of fundamentally different and the same?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. The thing that always strikes me, even looking at some of the news shows this morning before we hopped on this call is, I guess, just the shamelessness of Republicans. I mean, I was taking note today that Steve Scalise was doing the rounds of some of the right-wing TV shows. He was on Fox Business and he was on Fox News, and he was doing this media tour to talk about how Republicans are drafting articles of impeachment against Joe Biden because Biden has kind of threatened to withhold some of the military aid to Ukraine in a way that they believe is kind of analogous with what Trump was impeached for in 2019. And without getting too into the weeds, I mean, there's some key differences there, but it just kind of strikes me that, back in 2019, the big Republican argument was that there was nothing wrong with holding military aid. And now the shoe is on the other foot, and they can kind of weaponize this against a Democratic president. They're acting like it's, this big deal. And I think that's just kind of one illustration of the shamelessness that I see on a daily basis on the Republican side. That, kind of makes it easier for them to play dirty. Democrats do actually have principles and, have, things that kind of guide their conduct both politically and when it comes to making policy in Congress. And I think that Republicans don't have those same guardrails. And, obviously I think that kind of trickles down from Trump. And, I think whatever daylight there was back in 2015 and 2016 between what Trump represented and the rest of what the Republican Party represents is gone now. I mean, Trump has really kind of infused the whole party with his personality. And, I think this latest impeachment push, which is happening obviously as Jamie Comer's push to impeach Biden over, essentially Hunter Biden's business dealings, as that has fizzled, I think is a glaring illustration of that.
Yeah. And it seems like it's accelerated over time, this sort of collapse of reality on the right. Do you see that? Like everything, you live in this world, and I kind of worry about anyone, you included, who spends so much time watching this drivel. It's got to take a toll personally. But when everything becomes politics, and you and I live in a world of politics, but when everything is politics, you have, in another era, they called that totalitarianism.
I think it's certainly the way that democracies end up dying, in the sense that, when you enter into an era where things are so polarized, that it's really hard to get kind of just basic functions of government done, that can lead to people becoming disillusioned with democracy altogether. And, I really think that, unfortunately, is kind of one of the big stakes of this election cycle is, if Joe Biden ends up losing, and I would say the polling right now kind of reflects that it's, more or less a coin flip, and obviously we have just a little bit under 6 months to go, so a lot can change. But, I think we're kind of staring down the barrel of an era of politics where you're going to have, a Trumpified Republican Party that if Trump wins will probably control one or both chambers of Congress, and then kind of a hollowed out Democratic Party where the center that Joe Biden represented ends up kind of being on the retreat, and you have, a very loud kind of fringe on the left. And I think that could really, set the Democratic Party up for some years in the wilderness, because I'm not sure that, that there's a large enough coalition, for that faction of the party to win significant elections that go beyond primaries and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I'm immersed in this world, and I think that one of the other things to note is that there's a whole apparatus on the right where the notion of news media and propaganda has become very intertwined. Where Fox, when there are stories that reflect negatively on Trump, they either don't cover them, or in the case of like the Trump trial, which is just too big for them to ignore, they find ways to just kind of relentlessly spin it and turn it into the story about weaponized justice and Biden kind of pulling the strings from the White House to interfere in the election and sideline Trump. And if you watch MSNBC or CNN, you get a much more fair-minded take on the news, which obviously should be the function of journalism. But if you're a Fox viewer, and that's not an insignificant proportion of the electorate, you're kind of in this hermetically sealed information bubble, and I think it's very hard for Democrats to penetrate that, despite some good efforts by people like Pete Buttigieg and others to go on there and kind of speak truth or sense into Fox News hosts. And so yeah, I mean, it is kind of a bleak era, but I guess to maybe find a silver lining, I would say that during the Biden presidency, there have been a number of major bipartisan pieces of legislation that have gotten done. Whether we're talking about infrastructure bill, CHIPS bill, there's a huge climate bill that Biden signed into law a couple of years ago. So I think Biden has demonstrated that on the margins, and even beyond the margins, kind of more in the center of our politics, there are opportunities to get ambitious things done. But I think that's increasingly difficult as Trump has kind of fully taken over control and purged any of his people who were criticizing him or voted to impeach him at one time or another from the Republican Party. And I think that will only get worse if Trump wins. So I think from the standpoint of trying to have a sane politics going forward, it would be good if Trump lost, and that kind of caused a shakeup in the Republican Party to become a little more sensible.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot to unpack there. And I think two things in particular stand out to me. The first is about the media. In my view, so much of America's attention, and we are very limited, we pay attention to like three things at once, right? Then the sort of nationalization of news means that everybody's paying attention, chasing the same stories, and just talking about them for a particular period of time. And that agenda is almost always set by the right-wing media. I don't think people really understand this. They push some crazy idea, the left can't ignore it, and then the media, which is stuck in a both sides trap of its own making, turns the right wing's talking points into the week's story. And as you've said, it's mostly lies. And you talked about like Hunter's laptop. I bet most of the country has heard about Hunter Biden's laptop, but the story now has disappeared entirely because Hunter sued Fox and it was a lie, right? But for months, like it was the story. How do we? It was like a get out of jail free card for Trump's criminal acts. How do we break this cycle of, the right has figured out how to use both sides to jam the media?
Yeah, and you're right. And I think the Hunter example is a good one, because what I think that shows is that, as you touched upon, all of this stuff surrounding, Hunter Biden has been engaged in some shady business dealings. I mean, we can start there. But there's no evidence that President Biden at any point was involved in them. So this idea that there's impeachable offenses there never carried any water. And yet, now you have Hunter threatening to sue Fox over some of the, what he alleges are defamatory statements that have made it onto their airwaves. And, Fox has basically kind of taken the loss on this in the sense that they've stopped talking about him. They pulled down a documentary that basically featured a fake trial of him, that was on their streaming service, which kind of shows some consciousness of guilt. And yet, because they've been harping on this for 4 years, when the question of is Joe Biden corrupt is polled, it's a disconcerting, percentage of the electorate that, thinks that Biden is corrupt or, has engaged in shady dealing similar to what Trump has done. And so what I think that shows is that, by just kind of hammering this stuff, low information voters kind of get this ambient notion into their head that Joe Biden is corrupt, and that, that comes to bear in electoral outcomes where, people really, the fact that Trump is so egregiously corrupt should kind of stand on its own and be a big liability for him. But right-wing media, has helped Republicans out by kind of making it a both sides situation. And, in terms of what we can do about that, I mean, in my little corner of the world with the Public Notice newsletter, I mean, we try to hold media accountable to the extent that on our little platform we can. But, I don't really have a great answer for that. I mean, I think in a lot of instances, it's kind of up to voters to just try and do better. And certainly I think that, elected officials can kind of help in that respect. And I thought, Hillary Clinton yesterday was on Morning Joe, and she used part of her interview to really, kind of draw an analogy between what we're facing now in the United States and what Germany was facing in the early 1930s, in the sense that, you have kind of center-right elites that are helping this authoritarian take power, and how even American journalists at the time in the 30s thought the media outlets weren't doing enough to kind of expose what the Nazis were up to. And, there's kind of a similar dynamic here where the notion that Joe Biden's age is kind of this huge issue in the election. I think, the New York Times has been kind of a worse defender on that. The fact that they can't kind of convey the stakes more appropriately to people and, avoid kind of confusing them by inculcating this idea that, age should be a big issue that people vote on this year. It's disappointing, and I don't have great answers. I mean, we just have to, I guess, as consumers, if it's a case like that with the New York Times, I mean, maybe you consider unsubscribing or not subscribing to them, not giving them your money, things like that. But, it's a big systemic problem. And so it's probably something at some point someone, who has more time than I do right now should write a book about. But I don't have great answers. But, I certainly think that at this point it's kind of threatening it's threatening our democracy in the sense that if we can't get this right this year, I think we're in for some tough years.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I tell people this too. I think that the focus on the media is really important, but the country's not going to get saved by the media. It's going to get saved by activists, politicians, voters who show up. And to that extent, the idea that this year Democrats have decided to contest elections all over the country, as opposed to in the past where they said, look, we're not really going to spend money and send candidates to run in districts where they really can't win. They're finally bringing candidates all over the country in every local race now, and that will at least force Americans who only are in that right-wing bubble to at least be exposed to other messages, and that, the thinking goes at least, will make a difference. Even if those candidates don't win, it will change the overall margins in some states, and that may make a huge difference.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd add to that is we've seen since June of 2022, when the Dobbs decision came down ending federal abortion rights, that that has been kind of the negative issue for Republicans, and they're still really having a hard time running away from that. And so I think again I've kind of tried to make this point on social media a couple of different times that to the extent that anything matters this cycle, or still does matter, Joe Biden should win and Democrats should have a good year, because I think when you look at when you kind of assess things through the frame of the old Ronald Reagan question of, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? I mean, I think pretty clearly the answer for most people is yes, despite inflation taking a toll. The job market is strong. 4 years ago, we were all quarantined at home without a vaccine for COVID. Biden had an orderly rollout of the vaccines and kind of got us through the worst of the pandemic pretty quickly. When you look at kind of the core economic indicators, things are doing a lot better than they were 4 years ago. When you look at the questions of rights, reproductive rights, and other rights, the Democrats are on the right side of those issues. And so, to the extent that any of the traditional political benchmarks hold this year, I think it should be a good cycle for Dems. And I think what you're talking about with Dems being more competitive across the country, I think speaks to that. I mean, I guess the note of caution that I would strike is, that was something that I think kind of foiled the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, was that they were focused on expanding the map into states like Texas and Arizona, and as a result, they ended up losing Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and ultimately losing in the Electoral College. And so, you want to make sure that you're kind of protecting your flank. And I will note that the credible polling that has been done of these swing states recently shows, if anything, Trump's slightly ahead. In the Rust Belt states that are so key for Democratic hopes in the Electoral College. And so, I think if we don't get the presidency, not much, that's kind of the big prize, obviously, because I think, the damage that Trump will do in a second term now that he kind of knows the mistakes that he made the first time around and won't appoint people within his administration who will kind of work against him. Now that the party has kind of been hollowed out, and there aren't even people, like a Jeff Flake or a McCain who, at times took key votes to stymie him. I think those down ballot races, obviously at a local level they matter, but, if we have Trump in control of the federal government and using the Border Patrol to carry out, deportation raids in blue cities, it's going to seem like kind of small potatoes down ballot. But, that could be just me speaking to my perspective as someone who covers the national picture more than specific local ones.
Yeah. And I think coattails, though, are running backwards this year. So if you get a bunch of people running locally, you'll turn people out. That may make a difference in the top. That's my hope. Hey, there's something about, and you wrote about this, I want to ask you, the way I read the Time magazine piece. It was absolutely terrifying about rounding up millions of people and putting them into deportation camps, about turning the Justice Department into a political operation to jail its critics, about pardoning the January 6th criminals. It was absolutely terrifying. And let me just read a quote of yours because I want to go into it a little bit. You wrote, what's most striking in the interview is that Trump, even after 4 years as president, has virtually no grasp on any policy issue beyond empty talking points, most of which are lies. When asked how he will implement his plans, he waffles, obfuscates, delivers a stream of non sequitur boasts about how great he is, about how other people said he was great. He lies all the time, but many of his statements on core policy issues are so garbled and gassy, they don't even qualify as lies. It's like interacting with a chatbot programmed by a fascist parrot. I love that. But I want to ask you, do you think his ignorance and incoherence, in the end of the day, do you think they protect the public from the reality of the future he would condemn us to?
That's an interesting question. I think that, the fact that some of his statements are so difficult to kind of decipher or fact check, I think that does kind of protect him because, we see this all the time with Trump where he serves up a word salad and, someone like myself will point out when he says that there were very fine people on both sides of the white supremacist Charlottesville demonstrations that, he's essentially kind of praising these white supremacists. But then, his next sentence after that was something like, there are bad people on both sides too. And so then his supporters can kind of tease upon that as, look, these liberals are taking them out of context. They're being hysterical. So kind of the word buffet that he serves, I think, can kind of serve his interests in the sense that there's something there for everyone. That there's things for me to criticize. There's things for his defenders to defend him with. We saw this with the January 6th speech that he gave just before the riot at the Capitol, where, he said, because I wrote about this for Vox at the time, that during the course of that speech, he said fight or fighting something like 25 times, and he mentioned peace like 5 times. But, you can kind of hone in on those specific, sentences where he said something to the effect of like, it's, imperative that people remain peaceful or something like that. And then, his defenders say that actually the speech was peaceful and that he wasn't encouraging unrest or anything like that. So, yeah, you wish that people would actually read the Time magazine transcript because I think, just in his own words, that's a damning indictment of the fact that this is not a guy who has thought about policy at all. It's basically a bunch of hot air. We see this at his rallies all the time. It's not someone that you want in charge of the country, even if he was coming from a place of goodwill and, wanting to really do good things for people. On the flip side, he's wanting to round people up and put them in camps. But even how he gets there, I think, he doesn't really understand that. And so that's why he ends up offloading a lot of the actual policy work to people like Stephen Miller, who actually come up with plans. And, Miller has been talking openly in recent months about using the Border Patrol to go into blue cities and round people up. And so, it ends up being a kind of a system where Trump delegates the specifics to really odious characters in their own right. And he just does these interviews, that is basically a bunch of bloviating. And so, I don't know if that protects him or not. I would say that the response I saw to the Time magazine piece was pretty universally negative. And, I noticed that Trump, even on his own social channels, like on True Social, promoted the interview. And that to me, I thought was quite interesting because, you read it and it really isn't a very flattering portrait of him. But, I don't know if he wants people, at least on his own side, to kind of be aware of these horrible things that he's talking about in these interviews, or what the reason was that he would promote that. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to get this stuff to break through. And, this has been very consistent with Trump going back to 2015 that, it's a lot of scandals. It's a lot of gaffes. People like you and I talk about them, but on the Republican side, they just pretend not to notice, or they don't care, or maybe they're just so eager, for that next tax cut that it kind of cancels out any concern that they have over eroding democracy or just the brutality of rounding up people and, the reality that he's not going to stop with undocumented people. I mean, there's going to be a lot of other people caught up, in the crosshairs of these deportation raids and other kind of draconian measures that he wants to take. So, yeah, I mean, it's a really big question that you ask, but, and I'm not sure if it's kind of a self-protection thing, the way that he talks, or if it's just a matter of this is who he is, and it kind of has the fortuitous outcome that, it makes it really hard to kind of pin him down. And there's so many scandals that before one even really settles in the public consciousness, he's on to a new one. And he kind of keeps his opponents off balance in that way.
Yeah, I mean, his theme is that America and America's government is illegitimate in its current form, right? He doesn't say, oh, well, this democracy is a legitimate, wonderful thing, and we just need some policy changes. He says the whole thing's illegitimate, and only I can fix it. And that, I mean, you brought up 1930s in Germany. I don't usually go there, but 100 years ago, 1924, in Germany, Hitler was on trial for treason because of an attempted coup. And he was found guilty, but his defense was, how could I be guilty of a crime of treason when the government itself is so corrupt and awful? I'm just doing the right thing for the people of Germany. And that trial is what made him. And ultimately, after he served his time, led to their takeover of the government. And so there is this weird parallel. I'm comforted that this week, Democrats and Republicans got together and saved Speaker Johnson, who then gave a bunch of talks saying, you know what, the guy across the table isn't the enemy, we just disagree. And that's the kind of talk that might save us from people thinking we have to throw the whole thing out. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm kind of two minds with the Mike Johnson conversation because, I agree that, from the standpoint of just wanting to look like adults, I think Dems kind of did the right thing. I mean, Johnson obviously came through on Ukraine aid, which was, a huge issue in the sense of just the global fight between authoritarianism and democracy and kind of trying to stop, Putin's aggression, which it's very unlikely would end with Ukraine if he has success there and is able to kind of gobble up the country. So I get it from that standpoint that, Johnson kind of came through on a major priority. It really should be, it's a bipartisan priority to an extent, although kind of the Trump faction of the GOP, which is the majority of it, is out on Ukraine because, they're basically on Putin's side. But on the other hand, I clipped yesterday Johnson on Fox and Friends during the morning where one of the hosts put to him, citing the Time Magazine interview, that Trump wants to round up 11 to 15 million immigrants. And basically asked him straight up, are you okay with this? And his answer was absolutely. And so I do think it's kind of a bad look in a way for Democrats to be empowering that, even if it is in kind of the service of having a functional Congress. Let's be real here that we're, 6 months up from a presidential election. Congress is not going to be up to a whole lot this year. I mean, the era of the bipartisan Biden deals and the big legislation that he did in 2021 and 2022 is long gone. So, I could have it wouldn't have bothered me if Dems would have kind of held the line and said, if they want to remove their own speaker, more power to them. And they probably would not have been able to come up with one who would have been able to get every single Republican vote, which is what they need at this point to have a majority. And so I don't really know what the end game would have been there. But anyway, so I think with Mike Johnson specifically, I mean, I think when you kind of look at what he actually stands for, maybe with the exception of the Ukraine stuff, it's pretty bad. And so I felt a little queasy with Democrats, supporting him and allowing him to stay in power. Although on the other hand, I do think that you're right that, for kind of low information voters or people who follow casually, the sense that there are kind of adults in charge and that, even if Republicans are a mess, if there's enough Democrats with a handful of Republicans who are behaving like adults, I think these are the things that can kind of help maintain a functioning democracy because, as you mentioned, that the 1930 Germany comparisons can be kind of overdone, although I do think they're very apropos because, Hitler in 1932 had a very bad year politically where the Nazi Party entered the year in 32 as the strongest party in Germany, but because the economy there strengthened throughout the year, Germany was kind of, in the early stages of coming out of the Great Depression, the Social Democrats ended up having a very good year, and the Nazis by the end of the year were kind of a spent force, a lot of people thought. But it ended up being kind of palace intrigue and, the fact that there wasn't a functional left-wing coalition that could get a majority. And, you had these coalition governments there that weren't based on majorities, and so they were basically kind of mini dictatorships. And just the dysfunction of the politics, the inability for the center and the center left to come together, even the center right, to have a coalition government that wasn't kind of extremist in nature, ended up empowering the Nazis to first come to power and then to consolidate their power very quickly and take control. And this was a point that Hillary Clinton made during her Morning Joe interview yesterday. And so I do think that dysfunction helps extreme factions. And so, to the extent that the move to keep Johnson in place was an effort to prevent empowering extremists, I do think that there was some wisdom in that at least.
Yeah. I know your focus is almost entirely on the national scene, but I want to just take a second and say how impressed I am, and many are, with what's going on in your home state of Minnesota. Minnesota and Wisconsin had opposite elections in 2010. And that allowed Wisconsin to be gerrymandered to the right. And Wisconsin and Minnesota are fairly similar states, but the for the human beings who live in those states started to diverge. And they got much better for the people in Minnesota in terms of the economy, in terms of education, in terms of health outcomes. It just shows it's a case study right next to each other in how important elections are and what a difference the partisan approaches to policy. And again, we're like crazed about politics, and government isn't politics. It just requires politics to do government. The difference is stunning. And, I think the Democrats in your state have taught others around how to start to, win. And I always think that the Great Lakes are going to hold for Joe Biden, that Wisconsin is going to hold, that Michigan's going to hold, and you guys are going to deliver. I mean, I have this sense that there's something really different going on here, and I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Republicans haven't won a statewide election here since 2006. So, I mean, it's been, and that's for all the different offices. I mean, that's for auditor, AG, the U.S. Senate seats, governor, go right down the line. And so it's been kind of lean years, for the Republican Party here, because in 2016, Trump came quite close. I think it was like a 1.5% spread that he lost to Hillary Clinton. And then, it was worse for him in 2020. I think it ended up being like 6 or 7 points here in Minnesota. The Trumpism stuff has never really played especially well here. And so the Republican Party has really struggled in Minnesota to develop an identity. I mean, they kind of leaned in for many years to these sort of generic white, kind of businessmen guys who don't really have a lot of charisma. And that wasn't really a winning formula, but they have never really had like a bench or like young people coming up who could kind of infuse a different energy into the party. And meanwhile, the Democrats have been very strong here. Everyone from, Mark Dayton, who was a 2-term governor, to Tim Walz, who's really emerged as kind of a national figure. Obviously Amy Klobuchar, Tina Smith, even Keith Ellison as AG. So it's been kind of that combo, I think, where, I think Democrats in Wisconsin have had some issues with candidate quality, that has allowed people like Ron Johnson to keep their seats term after term, not to mention all the gerrymandering and, just kind of the institutional things that, the ways that Republicans have kind of rigged the game over there, at least at the state legislative level and, especially to kind of entrench their power. So I would be shocked. I mean, I think that if Minnesota goes for Trump this year, Trump is almost certainly winning the election at that point because, we have to go back here to, I think it's like, 72 with Nixon was the last time I believe that a Republican won Minnesota. I think Minnesota currently has the longest active streak because even in '84 when Reagan had his huge landslide, of course, the Democratic candidate was Mondale, who was, a local guy. And so I believe it was like it was Minnesota and like DC that were the only two places that the Democrats won in '84. So anyway, my point simply being that given the history here of Republicans losing and the fact that Trump has never really been especially popular here and hasn't really had coattails at all, I would be very shocked if he wins. Now, I will say that the polling that has been done, and there's been very little of it, has shown that, again, even here it's kind of a coin flip. But, even at this relatively late date, we're within 6 months now, those sorts of polls aren't super predictive, and, a lot will happen between now and November. So I would be surprised. But, yeah, I think, just to kind of underscore your point, whether you're talking about LGBT rights, whether you're talking about like free meals in schools, legal cannabis, right down the line, Minnesota has been a model of Democrats winning elections, having power, and using that power to do things that benefit people here. And so I think the record kind of speaks for itself in that respect.
Yeah, it's exciting. Well, Aaron, I have 2 more pages of questions I'm not going to get to because we're out of time. Love your work. Tell everybody how to find it.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. I'd be happy to do it again if you'd like to get to those other pages of questions that you have, because it's fun talking with you. But you can find Public Notice at publicnotice.co. We're publishing 4 times a week. If you enjoyed this conversation today, I think you'll enjoy a lot of the topics that we cover in the newsletter. And then if you want to follow me on social media, you can find me on Twitter at @ATRupar and on Threads at Aaron.Rupar.
Thank you so much. I'll take you up on that offer and we'll do it again.
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Bye.
You're looking at the big picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.